So there was a story that in the old time in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, it used to the money wasn't exactly lying on the streets. It wasn't like America, which was called the Golden Medina, was called where the streets were paved with gold. On the contrary, in Yerushalayim and in general before, let's say in the 20s and the 30s, the people were very, very poor. Poverty was something that was spread throughout everything. And it came to a wedding. When you had a wedding, not necessarily people wouldn't necessarily would be bare minimums that they would be serving for the wedding. Meaning to the point that when they served you your plate, they would ask you, "You're not hungry, right? You don't really want to eat the food because they're hoping they'll be able to serve someone else, save as much money as possible." Now it came to such a wedding, and we were in the middle of preparing for this wedding, and it's not like the money, whatever they invest, is not something you could actually come back and get it again. So they found out that so all of a sudden there was a big mistake happened. Some milk had fallen into the pot where which was full of meat. Catastrophe. Milk and meat together, we all know, is something that's forbidden according to Jewish law. Says there was a big catastrophe. What exactly they were going to do? So of course we all know, you go 60, if there's 60 times the amount of meat to the milk, then you go and it's permissible to eat. But it wasn't 60. So he went to the rabbi. What should we do? So the rabbi thinks for a second. He says, I'd like you to call a Sfaradi. Call a Sfaradi. Because he wants to tell the Sfaradi to ask. They were Ashkenazim. The people by the wedding were Ashkenazim. He says, tell this Sfaradi to ask an expert, an Arabic, someone who's a food connoisseur, someone who knows food. He should eat from the pot of meat. If he tastes food, if he tastes the milk, then the Sfaradi should eat it. And if he tastes milk, it's forbidden. But if he doesn't taste milk, then the Sfaradi should eat it. And if the Sfaradi eats it and he doesn't taste milk, then everybody's able to eat it. And that's what happened. That's what they did. They told the Sfaradi, told a non-Jew, told an Arab and a non-Jew, he ate some of the food, he didn't taste any milk, the Sfaradi then ate from it, and then the Ashkenazi ate it. What's going on? What do we have? Meaning, what is this sort of, seems like there's arguments, there's disputes. What is it? How does it work that if the Torah says that you have that you're not supposed to eat milk and meat, you have one people who starts listening to non-Jews if they eat it, and one people who don't. And
when did this happen?
I believe in the 20s.
1920?
Yes, 1920s. And if you look at it, another point. You look around Shul this morning. You see that in the middle of Chazaras Hashatz, all of a sudden people started taking off their tefillin. A bit too early. But what did they start doing? They took off their tefillin and they put on another pair of tefillin. Which is why are they putting on another pair of tefillin? Because there's two opinions about how the orders of the parashiyot, the order of the scrolls in the tefillin should be located. One is the opinion of Rashi, and one is the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam. So therefore, the general consensus is we follow Rashi, and therefore all our tefillin, the tefillin we first put on, is according to Rashi's tefillin. But the halakha says we should also try to, those who are careful should also put on Rabbeinu Tam, just in case you don't make a bracha, but just in case you say the Shema and say something, and to add something. So the question is what's going on? Is it one way or is it the other way? What happened? The tefillin is something that Jews throughout history always put on. They always were all putting on tefillin. So what do you mean? Is it a mistake? We're not sure which order the parshiot should be, and therefore, why don't you just look? Meaning, Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam lived in the. I'm not exactly sure, but let's say they lived in the time of the Crusades. Rashi lived. The time of the Crusades would probably be in the 12th century, in the 13th century, in 13th century. So he says they lived in the 13th century. Many thousands of years had already passed since Matan Torah. Didn't they? Why can't they just look at what their grandfathers did, or great grandfathers fill in? They would see either it's one way or the other way. Why? Where does this argument come? Where do these arguments come about? If in essence what we're saying is that God gave the Torah Mount Sinai, He gave the Torah to all of us, where do arguments come from? Why are there arguments?
Probably because it's nowhere clearly written how.
Okay, you bring up a very good point. This is very much part of the foundation of what we're going to say. Any other points?
Well, there wasn't much to write in these times.
What do you mean?
There was no books. There was some.
There wasn't much to write when.
No, I retract. I retract. But you could see what your father did. I mean, you could see it at home. You just...
Right, so that's the question. That was exactly the question. Why aren't they, looking back, why didn't Rashi look what his grandfather did? And if his grandfather had tefillin, or they did it as in the past, if it had tefillin one way, they would do it the other way. If he did it, and Rabbeinu Tam should have still, if Rashi's grandfather wore that tefillin, it must be that's what always was right. Well, meaning, why is there a difference of opinion? Right? So what's going on? So, as a general point, that when Hashem gave us the Torah, Hashem gave us the Torah out of Har Sinai, He didn't just give it to us. We know we have the oral Torah, meaning the written Torah, which is the part which is written down. This is the five books of Moshe. But He didn't just give it to us as it is. Because if you just take the Torah as it is, you wouldn't be able to read it in one word. You would not be able to read a single word. Because the question is where would you put the periods? How would you know how to read the words? You wouldn't know how to read the words. For instance, the same word of lo signov, you should not steal, could be said as signov, you should steal, period. Law is referring to something, when alur is referring to something else, the one beforehand. But signov is saying it clearly, steal. And if we go through everything, if you really start dissecting, start thinking about it, every sentence, and in general, throughout, when we send emails or we send texts, it's you have to always be very careful where you put the periods. Because sometimes if you did put the periods, it could be read wrong. It could be read incorrectly, and people get very insulted if they read your text incorrectly. It could be the same text, same email which you're trying to send and trying to be a pleasant and nice thing. People could take look as if you're insulting them. And therefore, the Torah which was given wasn't just given with just words, but rather Hashem gave to Moshe also how to read them, how to read the words, and what's the explanation of the words. For example, when it comes to tefillin, what is tefillin? If you read throughout the entire Torah, do you see anywhere where it says what tefillin are? What does it say? What? You should put it as a sign on your. What's it called? You should have as a sign on your arm, and it should be a totofos beinei nachal. It should be a totofot. What is a totofot? It should be between your eyes. What is that?
Can be everything.
It can be anything.
Tomato.
It could be a tomato. Yeah, it could be a tomato. Exactly. It sounds totafot. I guess if you kufsa. Yeah, but how do we know? How do we know that totafot means a kufsa? How do we know that totafot means a box?
Box. Yeah.
How do you know? Maybe it means something else. How do you know that these words have the explanations of the words? For instance, you have also from an esrog. It says the pasuk says in the Gemara Sukkah. It says that borrowing from the pasuk. It says you should take lekach lechem pli etz hadar. You should take for yourself a fruit from a tree hadar. That's what it says in the pasuk. But we all know it's an esrog. How did we know? How do we know? Oh. So this is the point of Torah Shabal Peh, which means that there are many things which Hashem gave to Moshe. He gave over to Moshe and explained exactly what the meaning is. Now, this explanation of the meaning can also be, as the Rambam explains, can also be hinted to in the pasuk, which means the explanation of, for instance, of what the etrog is. We could figure out that we could also see a hint of the words pri etz hadar that it's referring to an etrog. And there's actually this difference of opinion of where do we see it in the words. One opinion says that it's hadar, which means it lives, it dwells, and it says that esrog it takes a full year for it to grow, unlike other fruits. It takes a full year for it to grow, and therefore we're saying that it's referring to a fruit that's hadar mishana l'shana. It spends in the entire year which it actually dwells. It says one another person says pri etz. There's a fruit which has the same. There's a fruit which the branch that it grows from has the same taste as the fruit itself, and therefore that's how we know it's a pri etz. But in essence, the argument is only where we see it from the pasuk, not necessarily what the meaning of what's it called is. The real classic example, which is something which is the Islam doesn't necessarily looks at it, takes it very literally, and we know that it's not, is ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. It says in Parshat Mishpatim that you take an eye for an eye, a hand for a hand. Now, no one argues between all of us, meaning in the Torah, that what it means an eye for an eye doesn't necessarily mean if you punched out someone's eye, your eye gets taken out. But rather it means you compensate the person for their eye. In Islam, you actually do an eye for an eye. You take things very literally. Whatever they took it very literally what it says, and you take if someone chopped an arm off, you take the person's arm off. If someone takes part, I think it was just someone who was just a ruling recently in Iran that because a person blinded someone in their eye, so this person's eye gets blinded. That's the way it goes. But in the way we got which Hashem taught Moshe, gave over, the explanation is that no, an eye for an eye doesn't necessarily mean literally an eye for an eye, but what the explanation is that it means means you compensate for the person for their eye that it is. So therefore, in those things, there is no arguments. There is no arguments when it comes to these points that you have whatever the meaning of the Torah, of what the explanations that Hashem gave over to Moshe. There's no arguments of what they mean. Everybody agrees throughout the entire Gemara, throughout the entire Talmud, but everybody's agreeing with the point what these things mean. There's another point which is called this Kabbalah. What was received? In receiving, there's another level. What's called Halacha Moshe Sinai. That not only was the explanation which was given to Moshe, but as also this was also halacha which Moshe received, a separate halacha, not necessarily something based on the words of the Torah, but another halacha another law which God gave to Moshe Rabbeinu. Then there's another concept which means that God didn't just give us the ability to just receive, but He gave us the ability to also derive. He didn't just give it to us meaning He just gave us everything, but rather He also gave us that we're able to derive something from Torah. We're able to come up with our own laws based on something very important. Every morning before we start, this is the part before we start the main tefillah, we start off saying this is where the Chazan starts off, and afterwards you say Kaddish. What is that? We start off saying by the end of the Karbanot, a Mishnah. Rabbi Shmuel Omer. He said, Rabbi Shmuel Omer b'shlosh esrei midot haTorah nidashet. There's 13 principles which we derive from the Torah, which we actually use these 13 principles, and from these 13 principles you could actually learn out from the Torah. And based on these 13 principles, we're able to learn new laws. We're able to apply the laws of the Torah, which not necessarily the laws which are applicable. The questions of the day. You're able to learn from the Torah from these 13 principles. Okay, so therefore we have 2 points. We have what we received, and then we also have our input, what we're able to get. Why did God give it? Why did God do it this way? On one hand, why didn't He just give us everything? Most of the people will say, why do we have to work so hard and learn out? God should have just had the Torah should be the one book. The whole Talmud should be in the 5 books of Moshe. You should have everything. All the Talmud, all that should have been very, very clear, and everybody reads, knows exactly what to do. What do you guys think? Why not?
Otherwise, the rabbis would not have much work.
Right. It would put the rabbis out of a job. Okay, that was definitely. And man, we say so. God, you say what really God had in mind was just thinking about to give a poor guy work.
Every generation is also put to a test with new inventions and new.
Make it let's say, create the possibility to adapt to a changing world.
Oh, okay, very, very. So this means that Torah is eternal.
Yes.
The Torah is something. Torah is something is everlasting.
Yeah, adapt is not the right word, but to be applicable. Also in new situations.
Correct. Very good. Very good. So applicable and new. That means though the Torah, we know the Torah is called Torah Chaim. It's a living Torah. Which means just like a living thing is something which is applicable. It lives. It's a living being. It's not something which is only of the past, but something from the present. Same thing. The Torah is not necessarily just a book of 3,000-year-old from 3,000 years ago, but rather the Torah has lessons, and it can be applicable in our day-to-day lives as well today. And therefore, what we have to do is, in the same principles which are written in the Torah are there, we just have to see how it applies. And the jobs of a rabbi today is also to try to figure out how do the principles and the laws of Torah apply to a modern technology. How do the laws of Shabbat apply to electricity? How do the laws of Shabbat apply to starting a car on Shabbat? When it comes with medical ethics that you have questions. Earlier we had problems of abortion, but you have new medical questions. You have the present which the stem cells and all the new questions. How do these same principles apply to these present times? And therefore, that's something where the Torah gives us the ability to do that. But this question still becomes: why didn't God just Why didn't God just lay it out? So there were certain things would have been applicable for year 2000.
Exactly. You could have put what's applicable now and then deduced what's applicable.
The later, I don't know if he would have done a new revelation, but it could be the certain things of the Torah which we don't necessarily understand. Not everything we always understood throughout the entire times. I heard something very, very good example for that. It's brought down in the Gemara that there's someone, if it brings out laws, if someone is, we know a Kohen, or in general, is not supposed to become tameh, not supposed to become impure. Not supposed to become impure. Now, so they're only impure when they're in a area which is impurity, like a cemetery with something of dead people, and then at that point it becomes impure. Now the Gemara speaks about if someone's shot by a cannon. He's in a box and he's shot by a cannon, and he's traveling over this. He's traveling over, or not a cannon, but a catapult. He's traveling over this area. What would be the law? Is he become tamei or not? So, years ago, this was a very unlikely case. Meaning, for the Gemara to be speaking about this seems something like very interesting. Why is this really coming up? Is it very, very unlikely? Why did this come up? But this law is very applicable today. Every time you take a plane, you're in a box, and the same thing, you're flying through the air over a cemetery. And the question becomes, if a Kohen is on an airplane, does he become tamei or not? So you're right. So you bring up Dr. Hirsch is bringing up a good point. The thing is, why? Meaning, it could have been written some things in the book that we would have understood then, and certain things we would have understood later. We just make it a big book and do it then. But the Maharal gives a very interesting explanation to, in general, how these two different points. What he says is when God wanted the Torah is God's gift to us. God is way above us. Someone he's spiritual, he's way above our limited being. And he wanted to use the Torah to bridge the gap, to make a connection between us as limited human beings to the infinite. In theory, it's two different extremes, two worlds, they can't combine. Infinity and limited just don't work together. But you have a middleman. The middleman is the Torah. So on one hand, as in every middleman, a good middleman has to be able to speak the language of both people. If you're trying to make a deal and you only speak the language of one person, that's a physical language, that meaning the practical language, you won't be able to speak to the other person as well. But more than that, not just in regards to the same language as in let's say Dutch or French or English, but also the same was able to speak to the mind of the other person. If you're trying to broker a deal and I'm trying to speak to you of how that you should understand it, make it seem good for you, I have to understand why it's good for the seller, and it means to explain the seller why it's good for him in his mind to sell, and then I have to also explain for the buyer why it's good for him in his circumstances to buy. Same ideas when you have in relationships. What is a good a lot of times a good marriage counselor? A good marriage counselor is able to, though they have problems, is able to speak to both of them, that both even though a man and woman don't necessarily think, they think very, very differently, be able to find the bridging gap, and he or she is able to understand both ways of thinking, and able to find a way that we're able to speak to both and bridge the gap in both. So when it comes to the Torah, we have to have on both things. We have to have on one hand, we have to have the part of it which speaks, is divine, comes directly, infinite, directly come from God. But then we also have to have the point, it's connected to us. It's also finite, has our input. And therefore God did something very, very interesting. He made the Torah, on one hand the Torah, if you look in Torah Shebeksav, you look at the written Torah, it's all coming from God. God dictated, He commanded, and we're not necessarily everything we understand. We don't understand everything. This comes from God. It's the word of God. But he also put in the Torah something which is that also our input, what we can derive, which makes it the Torah part of it. We have an input, our relationship. So therefore, in the relationship, to bind the relation, the Torah has both aspects. He has, on one hand, the godly part of it, and also he has the part that we relate to, we are connected to. And therefore, the Torah, which the mission of the Torah is to connect us to God, is able to fulfill that. It connects us, which means us finite human beings, to God, which is infinite. And therefore, the Torah has both of these aspects to it, both of these purposes of able to connect both things. When you speak about things which you have, when it comes to my own intellect, when your own deriving things, then you can have arguments. If I think, it says, you say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So if you have, when you're learning to understand, if you're going back to the original point of why are there arguments if the Torah is divine, because when you look on the level which we are deriving from the Torah, that's going back in the time of the Talmud, when the Tanaim would go and learn from Torah different points, they're deriving, each one's mind thought differently, understood things differently. And therefore the halachot which they would be coming from at the end would be one different than the other person. Meaning the Torah tells us, what do we actually act on? We follow the majority. We follow a yachid v'rabim. If there's a single pillar majority, we do follow the majority. And therefore that's what we follow. But in general, the fact that we're deriving certain things from Torah, we're learning using the 13 principles which we were given. When we're trying to learn at that point, then therefore it's going to be a difference of opinion, and therefore on that level you have differences of opinion. So when it comes to the point of coming back to our original question, it comes to the point of why do you have some people wear Rashi's? Why do you have a tefillin of Rashi or a tefillin of Rabbeinu Tam? 2 different types of tefillin, because you have 2 different ways of learning and deriving from the Torah. You had the one way of thinking that this should be the order, and the other way of thinking that this should be the order. And it very possibly could be that they always wore it that way. They always wore 2 tefillin. Just later on it became more extreme. Later on it became more extreme, is either one way or the other way. People became 2 different camps. But throughout all the ages they always wore there was always 2 ways of looking how to put on tefillin. Or even so, it could be in the earlier generations they only saw it one way, and in a later generation they also figured out something new, a new concept of doing it. The Torah tells us that you have to go to the shoftim sheyeh bayamim hahem. You have to go to the judges and the rabbis and the sages who will be in your present day. And therefore, if that generation, they saw a different way of deriving from the Torah, therefore, then there was something, it was a new concept, they're able to do things a little bit differently, even though in the previous generations it wasn't able to do it. And that's why it could be that though in previous generations, could be throughout all the years, they put on tefillin one way. It could be even later on, Rabbeinu Tam came up with a novel idea of a different way to put on tefillin, and therefore that also gave him the ability to at that point. Another way to put on tefillin. Now, today's day and age, we don't come up with these new things. We follow. Meaning we have to new things. We come up with new things which apply today. We don't necessarily come with new things differently than the Talmud. The reason why for that is because they accepted at a certain point, all the Jewish people accepted that whatever is written in Talmud, we're all going to keep. We're not going to deviate from the Talmud. So since it was something that was all the Jewish communities accepted that, that's something which we keep with. And therefore, whatever written in Talmud, we don't go against what's written, meaning we don't come up with a new thing differently than what it says in Talmud. So going back to this point, going back to the general point, the reason why you could have two different Rashi and Beinu Tam is for this point, because there's two different ways of looking at it. At the same time, you have the Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. You have different customs.